Before I get started this morning, I would invite you to have a Bible or your Bible app out. I did not make any fancy, fun slides for you to follow along with today, and I'm really sorry about that. But I really am going to talk a lot about individual verses, scripture, and so if you find that helpful, I would invite you to have that in front of you as we begin. As you've already probably figured out, there is a lot of plant imagery in the text for this morning. But first, just a little context into the book of Isaiah, some things that were happening at the time. The book of Isaiah is likely written by a prophet living in the 8th century. And there had been a rise during this time of an upper class group. So suddenly, the resources that had once been shared fairly equally were no longer being distributed evenly. So the wealth gap is widening. You might know something about this. So before we even get to chapter 5, which is the first text you heard Jake read today, Isaiah has already, in the first 4 chapters, addressed exploitation of the poor, idol worship, excessive pride, mistreatment of land, and some other things. So already when you get to chapter 5, it's looking pretty bleak. But we get to chapter 5, and presumably this prophet named Isaiah begins by saying, "Let me tell you about my friend's vineyard." And then he goes into this sort of parable about some plants. His friend, the vineyard owner, did back-breaking work, digging out and removing stones. If there are any farmers out there who've had to do this in your fields, you know this is not an easy task. The vineyard owner planted choice vines, built a watchtower likely to provide some protection. It was a labor investment, and it was a time investment. Grapevines take a while to produce fruit, particularly enough fruit to make wine, which seems to be the end goal in this passage, because in verse 5 it says that the vineyard featured a wine press. So the goal was not just to grow delicious grapes, that was one of the goals, but to grow delicious grapes that would then make delicious wine. It's one step further than just grapes. The grapes were supposed to produce something more beyond just themselves. And the storytelling seems to emphasize this time and this effort, this labor that went into making the vineyard. But despite this incredible environment that was created to produce delicious grapes, the story tells us that the fruit was rotten. Some translations say the grapes were wild. Some translations say they were garbage grapes or just bad grapes. But the meaning is the same. The grapes are not good. The vineyard owner ramps up his exasperation with the question, "What more could I have done?" And then, in what feels like sort of throwing his hands up in the air, or giving up, or maybe even some anger, the owner says it will remove the protection, let the vineyard be trampled on, stop pruning it, and let it become overgrown. And in a final flourish of drama, in my opinion, even commands the clouds to stop raining and providing the vineyard with water. Yikes, right? Verse 7 finally names the characters in this story, saying, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel and the people of Judah." And so it's generally accepted that God here is the vineyard owner, and that the vineyard, the vines, and the grapes are referring to the people of Judah. So it is these people of Judah who have produced wild grapes that the owner of the vineyard did not intend. They were supposed to maintain their loyal relationship with God by treating others with honesty and equity and upholding justice. However, they allowed political and economic powers to divide the people and to prey among the poor. No longer does righteousness flourish. Rather, the people go wild in the fruit that they produce. The passage ends with verse 7, where God expected justice, God instead saw bloodshed, and where God expected righteousness, God heard crying. So on an initial read, I found God's judgment and conviction of this vineyard to be pretty brutal. Am I right? But I could also wrap my head around God's frustration, God's throwing up God's hands and saying, my gosh, I provided you with the perfect growing conditions, and look what you actually grew. I can understand that too. God saying, I provided you, I covenanted with you, and look where it got us. Also, you were not so long ago in a place of oppression, and now you are the oppressor. God is disappointed in the results of God's efforts. And it's not as if the issue was that no fruit grew. There were grapes on the vine. It maybe even looked from a distance like they were good grapes. They maybe even smelled like good grapes. But upon closer inspection, the grapes were sour and rotten and wild. And so maybe even worse than producing no fruit is like producing bad fruit. Fruit that walks around disguised as something tasty. And that made me wonder when and how often this happens in my own life with my own fruit. What do I disguise as good fruit that once tasted proves to be sour and rotten? And it makes me wonder about things that we call justice that aren't justice. Beneath it all, love of God and love of neighbor are no longer at the center of Israel's life, and the consequences are dire. Israel has made a mockery of covenant, and now they have the stinking fruit of injustice and oppression. And our reading ends right here on verse 7. Real depressing. Imagine you don't know the rest of God's story. What do we do with a God who looks to have given up on the vines? In a conversation with another pastor this week, I was lamenting over this somewhat gloomy text I was supposed to preach on today. And they asked me, well, what's the blessing in a God who gives up? And I thought that was a very strange question. And yet I did have an answer for that. For me, the blessing is that God knows kind of how I feel right now. And maybe I can stop beating myself up in the moments where I too feel like giving up. Our dean alluded to this, but the world feels kind of gloomy. We are peppered right now with hatred and violence, sadness and brokenness and division, and people's certainty about what's right and what's wrong. And some days I do feel like giving up. So yeah, God's right here next to me saying, I get it, I understand, and you're not alone. And that feels like a blessing to me. A lot of things around us reeks of death. And God says, yeah, let me tell you about another time in my vineyard where death was prevalent. I know the feeling of disappointed expectations, and I know God does too. And so we sit in that space with God, and we get comfortable in the feeling of maybe giving up, exasperation, the gloom of bad fruit that could not produce wine. Maybe it's our own bad fruit, or maybe it's bad fruit around us. I would guess it's probably a combination of both. This text invites us to take an inventory of our lives and the fruit we're producing. This text invites us to reflect on the places where we hoard wealth and act as oppressors. And this text invites us to analyze our own vineyards and ask what kind of wine it might produce. But in this space, I think it's also to remember how this text began. At the very beginning, in verse 1, let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. At the end of the day, the text does not let us forget that we are characters in a divine love story. So yeah, we can feel what we're feeling, but we hold that in close proximity to the fact that we are characters in a divine love song. Our lectionary text this week does kind of an odd thing and says, don't stop in Isaiah 5. It pairs it with Isaiah 11, which are two passages that I found out this week are rarely paired together. Separated by 6 chapters, we're given yet again another plant metaphor. In chapter 11, we find a stump. Once grand, but now cut down, perhaps even reminiscent of an abandoned vineyard. And when we get closer, we see a small growth, a shoot, fragile, vulnerable, a little bit of green, growing from this thing that from a distance looks dead. It's almost the opposite of what we found in chapter 5, where from afar, the grapes look like good grapes, and you have to get really close to see that they're sour. Here, from afar, the thing looks dead, and you have to get close to see a shoot growing. There's still life left after all. This sprout is defined by the characteristics of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord. Again, so different than the characteristics of the fruit in chapter 5. So quickly, our fruit gets twisted into human power and abusive power, some above others. But against all odds, God is doing a new thing. This new thing, it says in chapter 11, will use speech and breath, righteousness and faithfulness to bring about change. It doesn't give the illusion that there won't be hard things, but that we can do something about it without the use of violence and weapons. It will use speech and breath, righteousness and faithfulness. Isaiah 11 has long been considered a messianic text, and by that I mean that the shoot from the stump of Jesse refers to Jesus and the vision of God's kingdom coming, and I agree. And this passage alongside Isaiah 5 offers us a hope of Jesus. We see a God who says, on one hand, my goodness, what more could I do? And a God who says, and still, there's new growth. Even from this dead-looking stump, I'm sending Jesus. And I actually think it's perfect timing that we have this text on the Sunday before we begin Advent. But it felt like not quite enough to read this text only as the shoot referring to Jesus. Like only reading it that way sort of lets us off the hook too much. What if we also read this passage as the shoot being this very community? We are also called to be the inbreaking of the future kingdom. We too are called to be the sprout. We also have a responsibility of reimagining justice and offering ongoing hope. And we certainly are responsible for our fruit. I don't know what kind of week you had, but I tend to get very overwhelmed by the stump. I get fixated on the seemingly dead nature of this thing that's been hacked off and cut down. But all God is looking for here is a sprout, the smallest, tiniest, most vulnerable plant life there is, a sprout. I don't have to be the Messiah, thank goodness, but you should be able to look at me and see Jesus. People should be able to look at our community and see Jesus, even if they have to get really close to see that tiny green sprout. One of my favorite parts of this text is that after it clarifies that a shoot shall come from the stump of Jesse, it says that a branch should come from its roots. It gives us this image that you have to go all the way down to the roots, like back to the basics or to the simple, to that one lifeline. And sometimes to find hope, I have to peel back those complexities and the paradoxes and just cling to the roots. Love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. These 3 remain: faith, hope, love, and the greatest is love. And maybe this is even what God was doing in the vineyard with all that, like taking away of the protection and not sending rain anymore. Maybe God knew the vineyard also needed to go back to the roots. Not only are the roots the beginning of the plant, but they're also buried and unseen, and they're in the dark. I think darkness gets a bad reputation in the church. But as we enter into this season where it gets dark at 3 p.m. or something ridiculous, where the days get shorter and the nights get longer, I want to offer you this verse from Exodus. If you want to look it up, it's chapter 20, verse 21. But it says something like this: "The people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was." This thick darkness indicates God's presence just as surely as the brightness of God's glory. And it's actually in Isaiah much later, in chapter 45, where God says, "I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness." Darkness does not come from a different place than light. It is presided over by the same God. The long nights of Advent point us to the presence of God just as the brightness of dawn does. Both are fertile seasons, both are growing seasons. And so maybe the call today is to climb down into the darkness of the soil and tap into the roots of love and goodness, faithfulness and peace. I heard this new idea this week that the greatest distance is between your head and your heart, and that spirituality is about getting them to meet. I've been sitting on that line all week trying to figure out what that means for me. And I thought today my head kind of feels like giving up, like I'm the vineyard owner who says it's too much. But my heart longs to sprout seeds of hope over my family, over this church, over Goshen. And so I'm holding both of these things, and I'm working to pull them closer together, the hard and the beautiful. We simply can't let the fact that we can't fix everything stop us from fixing something. I want to close today with a children's book. And I know I read a children's book to you, maybe even just the last time I preached, but I continue to be drawn to children's literature right now in this season of my life. Not even because of my kids, because they're kind of into chapter books, but I think it's this desire to find the roots. That in the complexities of life, I go back to this simple thing that I can trust. Like somehow in the simplistic nature of the words of a children's book, the text, the pictures of a children's book, that I can make sense of the world. And so I've been devouring picture books. And so today I want to offer this one to you as well. The book is called Something, Someday, and it's by Amanda Gorman. You might remember her as a poet. She has a wonderful way with words. You are told that this is not a problem, but you're sure there's something wrong. You're told that this cannot be fixed, but you know that you can help. You're told that this is too big for you, but you've seen the tiniest things make a huge difference. You're told that this won't work, but how will you know if you never try? You're told to sit and wait, but you know people have already waited too long. You're told that what's going on is very, very sad, but you're not just sad. You're scared and confused. You're angry. And maybe, just maybe, a little hopeful. You're told not to hope, but you keep hoping anyway. Sometimes you feel like you're all alone, but someday, somewhere, you find a friend, someone who will hope with you, who believes in your dream, someone who will fight with you. You make a promise to each other. You say, there is a problem, but it's our problem together, so we can fix it together. This problem is big, but together we are bigger. You make another friend and tell them it's okay to be sad. And they tell you Sometimes we'll lose, but that's all right. We'll try again. And so you do, together, working, together, beginning, over and over and over and over. Until you're no longer beginning, you're winning. Suddenly there's something you're sure is right, something you know you helped fix, something small that changed something big, something that worked, something that makes you feel hopeful, happy, and loved. Something that is not a dream, but the day you live in. Something that makes you smile as you tell someone else. May it be so.